Hey, what is up guys, Merkerman4 here, and today I am finally going to be bringing you my final thoughts and opinions on Doctor Who Series 10. So this video was originally going to be uploaded about 2 weeks after Series 10 finished, but I never really ended up having the time. I was going to watch all of Series 10 in one go, back to back, all in one day, but I just didn't have the time to do that, and so it ended up keep getting delayed, and I still haven't done that, but I did watch Series 10 in a span of about 3 days. So I feel like that's condensed enough for me to get a good idea of the series overall and how it flows throughout all the episodes. And honestly, I think now that it's been a longer amount of time, that's probably better because that freshness, that newness has worn off. And sometimes the fact that an episode is new the excitement from that can kind of blind your vision on how good an episode truly is. And so I think that now that it's been about 3-4 months since the series concluded, and about 7 months since the series began, I have a more fresh outlook on the series, and I'm able to see these episodes with a fresh set of eyes, and it'll allow me to look at them in a more fair light. And so I should also note that this is the first time that I've seen any of these episodes in their entirety since the original weekend that they aired in. And this also marks the first time that I've seen multi-part stories all in one go, as I had only watched them with the episodes a week apart, so now I get a better sense of how the story flows. So let me begin by giving you how I ranked these episodes. I gave them a number from 0 to 10, and this includes 0.5s as well. And I think over time, the way I've looked at episodes critically and the way I rate episodes has changed slightly. I think I've become slightly more critical, and I think it's a little bit easier for me now to give an episode a fair rating before, as well as the newness factor of it. I also feel like I was a little bit too generous sometimes, so I think that these ratings are a bit more fair, and they more accurately reflect the quality of the episode overall. And so the scale is 0 being worthless, 1 offensive, 2 bad, 3 poor, 4 weak, 5 mediocre, 6 decent, 7 good, 8 great, 9 excellent, and 10 masterpiece. And I'm also going to say that even though 7 is my threshold for good, really that's more of a very good, quite good, pretty good kind of category. I just wanted to use a single word to describe it. So when I say an episode is decent, for example, I do think that overall it is a good episode. Decent is more its quality of goodness. And so for me, anything that's a 5 or above is a positive review, and anything that's below a 5 is a negative review. But with that in mind, without further ado, let's get into each of the individual episodes and the stories. I'll do a brief overview of what I thought of them, and then compare my present rating to what I had rated them before. So obviously we have the pilot kicking off the series, and I think that as a series opener, this is a very strong episode. We really get to know Bill's character well, and the relationship between her and the Doctor is established in a great way, I think. And the university setting really lends itself to this story. I think it creates this really good vibe. The Doctor just feels like he fits in this kind of environment. However, outside of the characterization, the actual story elements to it is where this episode falters a bit. They're not necessarily bad, but they're really shallow, and there's not much substance to the actual story. And so I would say the story and the monster, they're all serviceable, but they're not really anything special. But the characterization does do such a good job that it kind of makes that aspect of it not quite as important as it normally would be. I should also note that at this point, I still thought that Nardole was unnecessary, and while he did get a couple laughs out of me, I did find him pretty pointless and even annoying at times. So I still didn't like Nardole here. But yeah, overall I would say that it was a great series opener, a great way to either introduce new viewers to the series or reintroduce viewers after the 1.5-year hiatus, excluding the 2016 Christmas special. But as an episode on its own, It's not really anything that special. It's a little bit bland, but overall, while it's not necessarily a bad episode, it doesn't really do anything that great with the story. And so I'm going to give the pilot a 6.5 out of 10 compared to the 7.5 that I gave it previously. Next up is our episode 2, Smile, which pleasantly surprised me quite a bit. Now that doesn't mean it's one of the greatest episodes of all time, and in fact it still is one of my least favorite episodes of Series 10, but that's not necessarily to say it's a bad episode. I thought that the emojis were just going to be used as a gimmick, and Frank Cottrell Boyce's track record, his only previous episode being In the Forest of the Night, didn't really give me high hopes for this episode. However, I thought that it was enjoyable all the way through. I thought the emojis serviced the story really well. They weren't a gimmick at all, which honestly really surprised me. And I thought there were some story beats and ideas that I really liked. Like the idea of the robots killing people who are grieving because they think that's the enemy of happiness. However, other aspects to it are really shallow and not explored whatsoever. For example, the colonists. We don't really get any time with them. They are barely there at all and don't particularly add that much to the story. The ending to this feels really rushed. I wouldn't necessarily call the solution lazy, but I would call it too easy. And I think it's weird that the Doctor jumps to exploding the city as a first resort as opposed to a last resort. But it was a thoroughly enjoyable episode and a first good proper traveling experience for Bill and the TARDIS. And so I'm going to give this episode a 6 out of 10 compared to 7 out of 10 last time. Third in the roster is Thin Ice, written by Sarah Dollard, who's previously written Face the Raven. This episode I feel pretty much exactly the same way I did when it first aired. I still think that Face the Raven is the superior of her two works, but Thin Ice is still pretty strong in its own right. Really the weakest aspect of it, I think, is probably the villain and the fact that it borrows a lot of story elements from previous episodes. But I thought that the environment that is established at the Frost Fair was really well done, and the characterization in this, the relationship between the Doctor and Bill, it's just superb. I loved it. Bill's introduction to traveling to the past, with her asking all these questions, was great. And I particularly love the scene where the Doctor explains to her why he has to move on. He doesn't have time to mourn because otherwise more people die. I love that scene. But yeah, it's overall a very strong episode, even though it does have its weak elements, and really was quite enjoyable throughout. It did feel like a real proper Doctor Who adventure, which while Smile was enjoyable, didn't quite reach those heights, I think. And so I'm going to give Thin Ice a 7.5 out of 10, one of the few episodes that has the same score as I gave it last time. Fourth up is Knock Knock, and my absolute favorite aspect of this, no question, is David Suchet as the landlord. His performance is just sublime. It's just fantastic. He does such a great job with the character, and I really like this villain. He's got all these different layers to him, and his motivations make perfect sense, and his menace is subtle at times, but then overt at others, and I just love his character all the way through it. And like I said, that's, I think, the strongest aspect of it. That doesn't mean that the other aspects are necessarily bad, but ironically, even though I thought the landlord was a really good character in this, all the other characters, for the most part, are relatively bland. Bill's friends, I never really got a sense of caring for them. They were just kind of there for the most part. And then the fact that they got resurrected at the end really bothered me because it didn't feel like it was earned, it didn't feel justified, and it felt like there were no consequences for what was going on. And so that kind of lessened the impact of the story for me. But even though that is the case, I think that the story was intriguing enough to keep me interested all the way through. And I thought that the ideas throughout it were good. They could have been utilized a little bit better, but overall it was definitely an enjoyable Doctor Who episode. And I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 compared to a 7.5 last time. Now here we have one of my favorites from this season. We have Oxygen. Oxygen is my second favorite episode of the season, my favorite up to this point, and I just love so many aspects about it. Jamie Matheson has previously proven to be a really strong Doctor Who writer with Mummy on the Orient Express and Flatline, and he doesn't disappoint here. The environment that they establish is really strong. You really get a good sense of the world that they're living in, where oxygen costs money. And I thought that even though the characters weren't super fleshed out, you still liked them. for the most part, they felt like real people. And so you cared when things happened to them. You cared when they died. The visuals as well in this episode were superb. The mining station looked excellent, and it was just so gripping and intense all the way through, especially Bill's fake death scenes. I do think the second one was maybe a bit too much. I think maybe one was enough. And usually I would be complaining about fake death scenes, but these are handled so well. And the explanations that they use for her not actually being dead make logical sense in the story, and they feel like they have a story purpose for being there, which doesn't happen a lot of the time. I do think that its third act falters a little bit, but I thought it was still good, and I love that the Doctor remains blind as a consequence for what's happened during this episode. Also, I should mention that this is the first time that Nardole has had a major presence in an episode and not grated on me. I didn't feel like he was out of place here. I didn't necessarily like him in this episode, but I thought that he fit. I thought that he had a place. And so I was really glad to see that. And so overall, Oxygen for me gets an 8.5 out of 10. Once again, another of the few episodes that keeps the same score as before. Now we have the Monk trilogy in the middle of the season. I've got some mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I did overall really enjoy what we got, but on the other hand, it had so much potential that did not get reached, mainly with The Lie of the Land. Another thing about the Monk trilogy is that this is the very first time I actually liked Nardole. The last story, I didn't mind him, but here, I actually grew to like him and be glad he was on the TARDIS team, which is a major turnaround from what I was feeling in the return of Dr. Mysterio and the pilot. So, good job on the writers, because they've turned this character that I really didn't like into somebody that I was happy was on the TARDIS team, as opposed to just not minding them on the TARDIS team. So, first off we have Extremis, which I thought was a particularly strong episode. I absolutely adored the ideas of it. The Pope asking the Doctor for help, the Veritas, the fact that they're in a simulation all this time, and that these creatures are using that to predict the best way to take over the Earth. All those ideas are very strong, and how it's presented is good as well. It's gripping, and the monks are definitely a mysterious and intriguing villain, and the twist, I didn't see it coming. It's very well presented. Then we also have the Missy scenes, which, while I thought they were good, they didn't fit with this episode whatsoever. Every time they came in, it just felt like it was interrupting the flow, and they really did not belong in Extremis. And unfortunately, Extremis doesn't really have an impact whatsoever on the rest of the Monk trilogy. The Missy things have an impact on the overall series arc, but you could remove Extremis and the events of the latter two episodes would not play out any differently. Which is interesting, because you'd think the fact that the Doctor has foreknowledge would lead to something, but when the Pyramid at the End of the World starts, they're already there, and the Doctor, nothing happens with him having foreknowledge of their arrival. The only other possible advantage that they have is that the Doctor knows what they look like, but even then, that's not enough information to do anything. Especially considering he's blind, it doesn't have an impact. And yes, we get a little bit more knowledge on the simulation, but that's not particularly necessary to the story at hand. So even though Extremis was a strong episode, it's a useless episode, which just sucks. And so for me, I think the Pyramid at the End of the World should have been the starting point for the Monk trilogy. This one I do think is just slightly better than Extremis. I do, once again, really like the ideas overall. The Pyramid appearing out of thin air, that's an awesome mystery. The monks have a really great imposing presence over the entire episode. The Doctor's blindness, I think, is used well. And I really enjoy the idea of the monks having to ask for consent to invade. That's a really intriguing idea. It's just a shame that we never learn why. We don't really learn much about these monks, which is what would have been expected from The Lie of the Land. And I really like as well, in Pyramid at the End of the World, the fact that the global crisis doesn't come from the armies or anything. It comes from a simple mistake of broken reading glasses and a hangover. That's it. It's such a simple thing that could lead to world-destroying consequences, and I love that idea. And yeah, so I felt the episode was tense all the way through. I thought that the ideas were strong with it, the monk's presence was strong with it as well, and it was a pretty serviceable part in this Monk trilogy. Finally, we have The Lie of the Land, which I can best describe as a disappointment, as a letdown. On first viewing, I didn't think it was a necessarily bad episode. However, now I'm starting to see its flaws a lot more prominently. Once again, I really like the ideas that run throughout it. The world that's taken over by the monks, that's presented in the beginning of the episode, is superb. I really enjoy the first 15 or 20 minutes up until Bill shoots the doctor. It's at that point where things go downhill and everything just kind of falls apart, in my opinion. For me, I would have had Pyramid at the End of the World be the first part, and then Lie of the Land split into 2 parts. You'd have all of the second episode being Bill and Nardole searching for the doctor, and then the end of that episode would be Bill finally confronting the doctor. This would be the first time we see him in the flesh, as opposed to on a screen promoting the monks. And then it would end with Bill about to shoot the doctor, and the doctor revealing that this isn't a trick, he's really working for the monks. Because that's such a fantastic concept. What if the doctor was the bad guy and the companions had to go against him? So it really disappointed me that it was a trick. And I'm not even going to talk about the stupid regeneration. I'm just going to say it's very obvious that it's there only to be included in the trailers, so that was terrible. It was also super disappointing that the monks didn't have a strong presence in this episode like they did in the last 2. They don't even talk. They barely feel like they're in the episode, and the solution is Love Saves the Day again, which honestly I don't think it's the worst thing ever, but it could have been a bit better integrated into the story. And then the monks are kicked off the earth way too quickly, way too easily. No fight at all. I also feel like Missy in this episode was only there once again to service the arc and didn't really serve a purpose in the episode itself, because I don't see why the doctor couldn't have easily just figured this out for himself. But yeah, so overall, Lie of the Land is a major disappointment. Lots of potential, but major disappointment. And so overall, I think Extremis is a 7.5, Pyramid at the End of the World is a 7.5, and Lie of the Land is a 4, compared to a 7.5, an 8, and a 7 that I had previously given these episodes. And overall, I think that the Monk Trilogy is still relatively strong because those first 2 episodes do such a good job with their content. And so I'm going to give it a 7, but it is taken down slightly by the Lie of the Land. I don't think that overall, though, the story deserves to be taken down that much because of the faults of Lie of the Land, because even about a third of Lie of the Land is still really strong. Next up we have Empress of Mars, which is the very first time we see the Ice Warriors on their homeworld of Mars, and this is the second Ice Warrior story written by Mark Gatiss. In my opinion, it is the superior of the 2. However, I'm definitely thinking this is a lot weaker than upon my initial viewing. Originally, I had placed this at this point as my second highest in the series, and then when the finale came around, it was my 4th highest. It's lowered down significantly since then. I did enjoy the episode, but not nearly as much as I remembered enjoying it. I thought that the Ice Warriors were represented relatively well, but the Ice Queen was pretty annoying and kept reminding me of the Empress of the Rachnos, and not in a good way. Although at times she was fine. But I think that overall it's a relatively weak story. It's got some good ideas in there, but it doesn't really explore too many places, I think. Although I do love the idea of Victorians on Mars. That is a really enticing idea and feels totally Doctor Who. But I think Catchlove, while he wasn't necessarily a bad villain for the episode, he was too much of a caricature and didn't feel like a real person. He felt like he was evil for the sake of being against the heroes instead of having some actual real motivation. And so that was kind of disappointing and jarring at times. But I do love the way that it sets up the Ice Warrior stories in Monster of Peladon and Curse of Peladon. I thought that that was really great, and the cameo by Alpha Centauri brought a huge smile to my face. But overall, I'm going to give Empress of Mars a 6.5 out of 10 as compared to an 8 out of 10 that I gave it before. Here we have The Eaters of Light, which is the very first new series story to be written by a classic series writer. This was my most anticipated, or at least one of my most anticipated episodes of the season, and it was slightly disappointing when I first watched it. Now it's a bit more disappointing when I watched it again. I think the major thing that made me like it so much upon first viewing was that newness factor, but now that that's worn off, it's really a pretty bare bones Doctor Who story, I think. It's serviceable. I did enjoy many aspects of it, but there definitely were parts where the story kind of dipped. I did feel kind of bored at points, and I think that this is partially because this is definitely paced more like a classic Who story than a new Who story, which isn't necessarily a problem, but I think in terms of this episode, it didn't really have enough content to fill out its running time, and so it had to be stretched, which is kind of ironic considering I think it's the shortest episode of the series. But I liked the idea of the Eater of Light. I love the sound of that name. It's just awesome, and the potential it had was really, really great. You know, the fact that it can consume all the light and then make everything go dark and cold forever. That's a scary kind of villain. Unfortunately, it's not really used to that potential. It's just kind of a generic monster that eats people, which is really too bad. It would have been great to see it actually consuming light for the most part. They do defeat it by poisoning it with light through these thingies, but I wish that the fact that it was consuming the light played a more significant impact on the stakes, on the plot, because you don't really get to see that. And I think that the two groups of the Picts and the Romans were well done, but I don't think any of the individuals necessarily were. They just felt like they were members of a larger group, as opposed to being individuals in a group. And I do really like Bill's inquisitive nature in this. I love the fact that she figures out for herself about the TARDIS translation. That makes her look super smart, and it's really well done, I thought. I thought the scene was really enjoyable to watch. But overall, it's more of a meh episode for me than anything else. It's not really one I'm eager to go back to. It's not the worst of the worst, but it's just kind of there. I will say it does have more good aspects than bad aspects. And so for that reason, I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 10. But it's not by a whole lot. It's verging on the edge of 5. And compared to previously giving it a 7.5 out of 10. And here we go. The big old finale. World Enough in Time and the Doctor Falls. My opinions on these episodes have stayed about the same since I first watched them, but they're both really strong episodes overall, so I'm really glad about that. I do think that this is one of Moffat's best finales, especially World Enough in Time. I thought that World Enough in Time was superbly done. I love the concept of the ship at the different ends going at different speeds, and I thought that this episode had the best use of the Cybermen since the 1960s. So that was really impressive. This was also the first time since their first appearance in the new series that I felt like they were being used as Cybermen as opposed to generic stompy robot monsters. Unfortunately, they revert back to that in The Doctor Falls, but for this episode, I can really enjoy the fact that they feel like Cybermen. And I love seeing the evolution of them. I also think that this episode has some of the best twists in any Doctor Who episode ever. Unfortunately, the majority of them were spoiled by the BBC beforehand, but the fact that John Sims Master is back, I would never have guessed that if I didn't know. The Mondasian Cybermen, that would have been a massive surprise, which would have been great. I might have been able to piece it together based off of what we saw, but I don't know, there's a chance I might not have. And the fact that even if I was piecing it together by myself, if I didn't know the Cybermen were going to be in it, I just would have gotten super hyped for it as I was figuring this out. And the fact that it was the original Cybermen would have made me even more happy. I think the fate that befalls Bill in this is just so tragic and heartbreaking, and it's really well done. And I think really my biggest complaints of the episode are probably Missy got a little bit annoying with her Doctor Who shtick at the beginning, and the fact that we don't really get a good sense of how long Bill spent down at the bottom of the ship. We know from dialogue in the next episode that she spent 10 years, but it honestly didn't feel like 10 years, so I wish they would have done a little bit of a better job in representing that, but otherwise, I thought it was a really strong episode, and I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10, just like I gave it before. The Doctor Falls is a pretty good follow-up. It's not perfect. Like I said, it reverts the Cybermen back to generic, stompy robot monster thingies, and you really could replace the Cybermen, except for Bill, with any monster, and it wouldn't change a difference to the plot. I think that the story is fine. They're having to protect these kids from the Cybermen. This episode is definitely one of characters. This is where its strength lies, and because there are so many characters that it does such a good job with, I do think that it deserves many more points than the pilot, which was really only working with Bill and a little bit with the Doctor, but not really. This episode, we get to see Bill's arc finally rounded off, we get to see Nardal's arc rounded off, we get to see two Masters facing off against each other, and Missy's arc rounding off. We get to see the 12th Doctor as he approaches the end of his life. There's so much character work going on here, and pretty much all of it is excellent. The story is more of a shell for it than anything else, but it does feel like it fits with the previous episode, except for maybe the Cybermen, because they're not represented nearly as well. But other than that, I think that it's definitely a strong episode, and I really enjoyed it all the way through. I think my major issue with it, other than the Cybermen, is the fact that the Masters don't play any impact whatsoever on the plot. While I really enjoyed their relationship, except for the innuendos, those weren't necessary. They didn't have an impact at all. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that when I talk about the series arc, but you could remove both of the Masters from this story and nothing would change. Except for, the characters, but nothing in the story would change. I also felt like I was a bit disappointed that Bill got resurrected. I'm not as upset as when Clara was resurrected, because at least this was set up, and the consequences of her still having been in that cyber suit still stand. She still has to live with that and keep that pain and sorrow and torture with her, and she had 10 years that built up to that betrayal. And so a lot of those consequences do still stick, but it is a little bit disappointing to see her revived again, because Stephen Moffat can't keep anybody dead, and it just doesn't feel like there are many consequences. But I do have to give Stephen Moffat props for Nardol's exit, which is honestly, I think, my favorite of any of Moffat's companion exits, just because it was so quiet and it was just simple. It wasn't over the top or anything, and I really liked that about it. And so overall, I'm going to give The Doctor Falls an 8 out of 10, just like I did before, and overall, with the story, I'm going to give it an 8.5, because I really enjoyed it. It had some fantastic aspects to it, but it does have its flaws, and but I do think it is one of Stephen Moffat's best finales. So, good on you, going out with a bang, Stephen Moffat. So overall, Series 10, what did I think? I thought that it was a relatively strong series. The Lie of the Land was the only episode I thought was bad. We did have one mediocre kind of episode with the Eaters of Light. But other than that, all the other ones I would safely say are good episodes of Doctor Who. And I really enjoyed the series. I think it is one of the most consistent series in terms of quality, even though my scores have definitely changed up quite a bit from when I first rated it. I do still think this is one of the most consistent. And even though its highs don't necessarily reach way up here, its lows also don't go way down here. And so I think because of this amount of consistent quality, it's got to be one of my favorite series, especially for the characterization. Even though the episodes may not be the best ever, I think the characterization in this series is just so well done. Bill is one of my favorite companions. I really enjoyed Nardole by the end of it. I thought Missy's arc was really enjoyable to watch. I thought the Doctor, they got a great mix of characterization for him between his Series 8 and Series 9 personalities. And so the characterization is really what wins this series over for me. It may not be my favorite series, but I think it's probably close to the top, in the top 2 or 3 of the new series. So I'm really happy about that. Now, time to talk about the series arc a bit. I already mentioned I did really enjoy it. I thought the idea of the Master actually trying to become good and side with the Doctor was really interesting to see, and I liked seeing that struggle. However, it doesn't play really any sort of impact on what happens in the series. The only thing that has an impact is the fact that the Doctor has to guard the vault in the premiere so that he has to meet Bill. Other than that, you could remove the arc from the series and really everything would play out the same. Yeah, you could say, well, because they went to test out Missy, that's what got Bill killed. However, it's clear that they chose a distress call, and that easily could have happened just on accident, because we see earlier in Oxygen, for example, they choose a distress call to go visit. So Missy did not need to be there for that to happen. That's the thing. Nothing is impacted by it. I would enjoy this so much more if it had an impact. I think this would have benefited if Missy had her own individual episode in the middle of the series, completely dedicated to Missy. That way, it would have been a more natural housing for the scenes that we saw in Extremis, as opposed to the jarringly put together version that we actually got. And then if the finale hinged on them, I think the problem was Stephen Moffat was trying to stuff too much in the finale. I thought that the idea of bringing back a past Master to try to influence her and for her to play off of and try to figure out what she really wants to do, I thought that was a great idea. It just didn't fit with the story that was being told. It felt like the arc was put onto these existing stories instead of the stories shaped to the arc. And I feel like the stories should at least have some sort of place to fit the arc in when they're written, as opposed to the arc just being placed on top of them. And so in that regard, this arc both succeeds and fails. It succeeds in being a good arc, but it fails at being integrated with the series. And so it's probably kind of middling for me. It's probably one of the weaker series arcs because of that. If it had been integrated better, it might have been a lot better, but who knows. I still didn't dislike the arc, I just disliked that it wasn't integrated. And so now that I've given you all my ratings for the episodes and everything, I can give you how I would order all the episodes. First off, we have World Enough in Time, then Oxygen, The Doctor Falls, The Pyramid at the End of the World, Extremist, Thin Ice, Knock Knock, Empress of Mars, The Pilot, Smile, The Eaters of Light, and The Lie of the Land. And if you want to go by stories instead of episodes, World Enough in Time and The Doctor Falls is at the top spot, then followed by Oxygen, Thin Ice, Extremist, The Pyramid at the End of the World, and The Lie of the Land, Knock Knock, Empress of Mars, The Pilot, Smile, and The Eaters of Light. And overall, my episode average is a 7 out of 10, which means that overall, the average episode of this series was a good episode, a definitively good episode, which is really good to see. Once again, it may not reach these super high heights, but it's definitely not a bad series overall, which is really encouraging. Finally, I just want to share a couple of things that changed up the most between my previous rankings the first time and then my rankings now. So first off, in terms of the actual rating I gave the episodes, some episodes suffered significantly. There wasn't any episodes where I actually thought was better than the first time I viewed it. There were multiple episodes I thought was the same, but there were also multiple ones where I did think were worse, or at the very least not quite as high quality as I initially touted them to be. And so the lowest of these was The Lie of the Land, which lost 3 points. The Eaters of Light lost 2, Empress of Mars lost 1.5, The Pilot and Smile both lost 1, Knock Knock and The Pyramid at the End of the World both lost half, and then Thin Ice, Oxygen, Extremist, World Enough in Time, and The Doctor Falls all stayed the same. And in terms of their placement in my episode order, we did have some go down, but there were also some that went up. And so the biggest sufferer of this was Empress of Mars, which got knocked down 4 whole spots. Then the Eaters of Light got knocked down 2, Knock Knock and The Lie of the Land down 1, Oxygen, World Enough in Time, and The Doctor Falls all stayed in the same spot, and interestingly, these are the top 3 spots. So I guess my favorites are all still the same. Then The Pilot, Thin Ice, and The Pyramid at the End of the World all went up 1 spot, Smile went up 2 spots, and Extremist actually went up 3 spots. What's kind of interesting is that some of these episodes, The Pilot, Pyramid at the End of the World, Smile, I put their actual number rating down, but they actually went higher in the actual episode ranking, which is kind of interesting. But there you go. So that's my final thoughts and opinions on Series 10. A very strong series for both Peter Capaldi and Stephen Moffat to go out on. I'm really excited to see what Twice Upon a Time is going to bring us. And yeah, so sorry it's so late, but it's here at last, and that's what's important. Please put in the comments below what you thought of Series 10 overall. What are your favorite episodes? What are your least favorite episodes? And where does this series compare to all the other series in the new series? Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and Mergenman 4, over and out. I'll see you guys later.